I like to swim in the shallow water. I like to swim and there's a lot of other people in the water and I'm not going in that deep.
Welcome to The Craft of Campaigns. I'm your host, Andrew Willis Garces. In this podcast, we go behind the headlines and hashtags, inviting movement storytellers to share lessons from social justice campaigns. Campaigns are a series of collective actions focused on winning a concrete demand beyond one-off mobilizations or election cycles. They have villains and heroes, teams that make plans to win, and activate people on the sidelines. In each episode, we explore one campaign through first-hand interviews for key lessons, principles, and practices for organizers today. In today's episode, and just days before thousands of women have planned to take the streets around the country for a march they're calling Bigger Than Roe, we'll hear another story about Amazon being forced to change their behavior by organized people power. In this case, after pressure from some of the millions of people on the Women's March email list during the start of the pandemic. And in some ways, this is a classic short corporate campaign. The group noticed a problem, price gouging, that specifically affected people buying baby products like diapers, identified a point of leverage, Amazon's public image, and forced the company to enact new policies by channeling outrage into a call to action. Amazon was the target, new policies to end price gouging was the demand, and people connected to Women's March were the base to mobilize, with tactics like signing a petition and participating in social media actions. And they hitched their narrative sails to emerging public outrage about pandemic profiteering. One way I think about how these campaign elements fit together is through the metaphor of an organizing flywheel. I know that's jargon and it requires you to visualize something with a few different parts, but stick with me for a second. The flywheel we've all seen is a bicycle wheel. You step on the pedal, it moves a chain, which pulls the wheel, the flywheel, forward. And all three components are now moving together, each one dependent on the other. In an organizing flywheel, we're trying to do a bunch of things simultaneously, like recruit new members, develop members into leaders, win policy fights, and each one is dependent on the other. You can't build a base without developing your members into member leaders because your members are your best recruiters. You can't develop member leaders without campaigns to train them within. You can't build campaigns without a clear base with whom the campaign has to resonate. And those campaigns need concrete demands of specific target decision makers, and so on. But in this interview, Caitlin Breedlove points out that it's possible for an organization to emphasize just one part of the flywheel rather than all of them. For Women's March, they're especially focused on the initial recruitment stage, using campaigns as what she calls political identity formation moments, and from which engaged Women's March supporters can move on to other possible campaigns and political homes. Quoting her colleague Tamika Middleton, a Women's March co-founder, she talks about this approach to recruitment and engagement as being a sign and a Sharpie, and shares why she thinks it's one antidote to a problem that plagues some of our campaigning organizations. Caitlin Breedlove is the Deputy Executive Director at the Women's March and also serves as the Movement Strategist in residence at Auburn Seminary. Since 2003, she has been organizing, writing, and building movements in red states, working across race, class, culture, gender, sexuality, and faith. She's a current board member and former co-director of Southerners on New Ground. Is also the former campaign director of Standing on the Side of Love at the Unitarian Universalist Association. She began her work in the South doing popular education organizer training at the historic Highlander Center in Tennessee, and is the former host of the podcast Fortification, which interviewed movement leaders and organizers about their spiritual lives. And she currently lives in Phoenix, Arizona. Caitlin Breedlove, thanks for being with us on the Craft of Campaigns podcast. Can't wait to hear about this campaign you're going to bring to us. Can you give us the trailer for this movie we're about to watch?
I feel like the trailer is early pandemic, a multiracial group of moms standing in Walmart, obviously not hardcore lefties, looking in a forlorn way at empty shelves where baby wipes and diapers and hand sanitizer should be. And then you zoom out to Amazon capping prices on everyday stuff that mostly women are buying for families. That would be the trailer. Maybe a little women's march cut in there, thousands and thousands of women marching.
It's a good trailer. So tell us a little bit about who you are and your connection to this story.
Sure. So my name is Caitlin Breedlove. I've been a organizer, strategist, writer in progressive movements for, I guess, exactly 20 years. I started off officially at the Highlander Center when I was 21. And all my work has been in red and purple states. I live in Phoenix, Arizona. I lived in the South for about 17 years before that, specifically Tennessee, Georgia, and then a pretty long time in North Carolina. So that's how I come into this story. And for many years, I've been really interested in mass-based social movements and lowering the barriers of engagement to get more everyday people into the kind of progressive work that I share values with. So I am the deputy director at the Women's March, and I'm one of the group of about 10 women, a multiracial group of women, majority women of color, who really took the Women's March from crisis back into an existing organization, and we're part of transforming it into the vehicle that it is today. So that's a little bit about who I am.
Awesome. And there are different characters, I think, in this story. So you're in this story. And can you tell us just about setting the stage for, so you're with Women's March, the pandemic is happening. What's the backstory leading into the teaser you gave us? How do we start?
One of the most important things to know about our work at the Women's March was that when a group of us transformed the organization and took over leadership, it was really because we wanted to save it for the women and our allies who had marched, not only in 2017, but much less well known is that the Women's March has had robust marches every season. And since then, we usually have somewhere between 500 and 700 sister marches. So in communities all around the country, folks who had never been involved in something progressive before were actually building their own political identity through women's marches. And so we really looked under the hood at what were the assets that Women's March had, and we wanted to give the organization back to the marchers and move their political will in this time. So a little bit about what's under the hood of the organization. In 2021, for example, which was not a huge year for us, we had about 163.4 million social media impressions. So if that was individual users, we'd be touching about 1 in 6 people in the country. It's not, but we think it's maybe around 1 in 10. We have a 2.9 million person base, very hardy, very involved base. And our money primarily comes from individual donations, which are around $17 each. So really giving you all a sense of what that infrastructure was that this story comes out of and why it was important to some of us. Like I mentioned, we're a women of color led organization. I'm actually the only white person in an executive leadership role at Women's March right now. And we're a lot of women and our allies, gender nonconforming people that come out of working class backgrounds or lower middle class backgrounds. We're not an organization led by people from elite communities, schools, etc. And so that's really relevant to the story because a lot of what we do is really center our political analysis and our work outside the progressive choir. I mean, I come from the choir, that's what I came up through, but that's not really where we're interested. So at the beginning of the pandemic, we were really trying to figure out how we could be a helpful force, particularly for everyday women. And one of the things that we noticed, this story starts when we really were trying to figure out how people were landing with the very first part of the pandemic crisis. And so I was in Walmart talking to people, also looking around. And one of the things that I noticed was that the shelves were completely sold out of things that a crowd of only women were trying to buy in that particular aisle in Walmart. So, hand sanitizer, diapers, baby wipes, that kind of stuff. And so, one of the things that we did was that with several of our corporate accountability partners, and a lot of other groups have worked on this, Amazon workers, holding other organizations accountable, was that we immediately went into a very quick campaign space because we're able to do that also because of our size, where we just ran a quick 7-day campaign to say, hey, Amazon, stop corporate price gouging on these items. Because what I noticed when I went home after those shelves were empty and those folks could not buy diapers and baby wipes and all this kind of stuff, was that in that particular part of the pandemic, very early in, the prices online, which most people were having to do, leaving Target or Walmart, going home, trying to purchase those things to come to their home, were becoming very expensive. So in Phoenix, hand sanitizer was going for $10 a bottle, etc. So I said to our team at Women's March, let's actually put this out here that this is wrong. There should be price caps on all of these items, which I think probably all of us remember that it was very hard to get those items for a while, particularly hand sanitizer, masks were hard to get. There was also a real shortage of toilet paper here in Phoenix. I know that was most of the country at some point, and household cleaners that people were stocking up on that were, antibacterial, etc. So essentially, we just ran a very quick campaign. Amazon responded very quickly because we were the partner in that campaign that was, had kind of the biggest bullhorn. And they said, oh, wait, Women's March is drawing attention to the fact that we're just allowing the prices on these items to go up and up and up. And they basically very quietly capped those prices very quickly.
Awesome. Yeah, if I could, I'm curious about just making sure that I got the flow of what happened. And so it sounds like you all quickly identified an issue, connected the dots. These aren't just any random products. Someone's getting rich off of this, but particularly impacting women, probably working class women more than anybody else. And then reached out to a few other organizations. Hey, is anybody else seeing this? Hey, who should we hold Amazon accountable? How should we hold them accountable? And then at that point, it was a grassroots petition, letter, email campaign. I'm curious about what that mechanism was and what sort of settlement worked like, or what collecting the win and figuring out what was next looked like.
For every one of these smaller campaigns, we're usually testing appetite to see how much the base wants to get involved. And sometimes we prep for potential campaigns and hold them off, waiting for moments where they might be possible. So just wanted to say a little bit about that, about structure. But yeah, essentially with this, we said, we want Amazon to stop price gouging. We contacted our email list. Yep, we had people sign up, sign petitions. Our base likes to do that. But we also hit it on our socials, right? So we build memes. Sometimes we do a text that's like, sign the petition. But a lot of our work is actually how we're utilizing Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, so that the reporters that always follow Women's March are talking about the fact that we're moving this campaign. I think it's very rare with any corporate campaign that a corporation is going to say, yes, you won. Here you go. You won, right? That's actually very rare. I think usually what we have to do is claim our wins, right? Because they have sneaky timing. Oh, this has nothing to do with Women's March and all of these incredible partners. This is just about like, we decided this is the right thing to do, right? So when we're talking about claiming a win, usually what happens is that Women's March and our partners will do something, and then there will be like, within the next 2 or 3 weeks, the win happens. And then Amazon says, no, we did this. This has nothing to do with y'all or any of the groups or any pressure. We're just doing this, right? And that's what happened in this case was you saw those caps materialize on those key items and others, and then it was pretty much a wrap. But like with many other campaigns that we run online, we're usually testing very quickly for the appetite that our base has to carry out this campaign because we actually think that they're in the driver's seat, and often we'll be interested in something and it falls flat because they're not interested and we move on quickly. In this case, there was interest from the base. It aligned with our values and goals. Otherwise, we never would have put it out there, right? And then we were able to achieve quickly this win, I think, because it became clear it would be very unpopular to not respond to that if you're Amazon, given the tone and tenor and the weather in the country. So that's a little bit about how we, engaged in this particular campaign. I think one of the things I would highlight is that I come from a very different grassroots. You build an arc of a campaign, you prepare, you ask a whole set of questions, you move much more slowly, and then sometimes you're running campaigns for several years, right? That's not what this kind of campaign. I could have given you, five other examples of short-term kind of whirlwind campaigns that were happening.
And I really want to get into the how this is different from what you just talked about, the tradition you've campaigning you come from, and how this is different, and the appetite for the base. I'll just ask, I think, one more question to see if I got the timeline right. And I saw that Senator Ed Markey early March put out a statement calling on Amazon to limit price gouging. By the end of the month, Amazon puts out a statement, which is still on aboutamazon.com, about how there is no room for price gouging and profiting off bad actors on our platform. And I'm curious about both where you all were in that month in terms of like the action cycle you did, and also just if there's any other, especially what happened behind the scenes that might be helpful for campaigners to hear about in terms of how you even got them to do a thing quietly, because I think a lot of people listening might have the experience of being asked to, there's a petition to sign whatever, and then don't actually hear about, so was there a win, was there not, how did we move on, did we test this for another thing, or this just transitioned to our next campaign. So if there's anything you want to share before we go into this is an example of a different kind of campaigning, that would be great.
We probably started talking about this maybe in February. It was maybe 3 or 4 weeks before, no longer. And one of the reasons I wanted to hold up this example is because actually there are times where we're floating rhetoric or narrative in the world and it doesn't move this quickly. And this was one of the times where it was really within 3 or 4 weeks, you see both of those steps happen, right? And I'm actually really fascinated with the way that narrative and discourse play into campaigns. But I think in terms of this example, that would be right. The only other thing I would add is that we do have ongoing buckets of work that are not specific campaigns, but they're narrative concepts that we pull from for concrete campaigns. So I'm going to give you this specific example. So this specific, short mini campaign cycle of actions, whatever we would call them, pulls out of our Billionaire Boys Club work, which is about what we call the Billionaire Boys Club Accountable. Why do we call it the Billionaire Boys Club? Because the 10 wealthiest human beings are in the United States are white men, and they all run, the Walmart family, Bezos, and we have an ongoing aspect of our work that, goes through ups and downs. Sometimes it's more visible, sometimes less. That's all about holding the Billionaire Boys Club accountable. So we're tweeting about that every time we're talking about, these rich dudes flying to the moon and back while other people are hungry, right? And it's all about sort of beating the drum around multiracial groups of working class women holding, the wealthiest 1% who are, most of their controlling interests are white men, accountable. And so this bucket of work connects to that. It also connects to the idea that we have, which is, of course, not an original idea at all, but like people really want concrete needs met. And working class people deny the elitist fake binary that often happens in progressive circles, that there's the brain wins and there's the bread and butter wins. And we do not accept that binary. So, often this campaign, really connected to concrete needs that folks have, you know, the baby wipes, the diapers, the hand sanitizers, but it connects just as directly to some of the narrative behind the scenes conversations we're having now, really concretely about not only reproductive rights and reproductive justice, but gas, groceries, formula, tampons, right? So we really feel at Women's March that often progressives and leftists are missing the boat on getting really concrete. Like, if you are impacted by the formula shortage, that is your baby. That is your baby not being able to eat. That is your child with disability who's 12 not being able to get the formula that they need to help them synthesize other food. If you can't afford tampons, that's your life. Like, that's a pretty big fucking problem, right? If you can't afford groceries, like here, Phoenix is, one of the highest levels of inflation. So every time I'm at the grocery store, there are head of households who I primarily assume identify as women who are struggling to decide what food they're going to get. So if this is not a problem for you, then it's not a problem. Like I said, if it's a problem, it's a big fucking problem. And so we want to actually locate ourselves as an organization much more around what are people's daily needs and connect that to our larger sort of narrative discussions.
Thanks for pointing that out. So, just closing the story part of this down in the sense of it sounds like y'all used a bullhorn very effectively and you were able to figure out this is a real concrete need that people have, women especially, on and off our email list. And hey, we have a big email list. We have a big base of people who are motivated to hold the Billionaire Boys Club accountable. Hey, test this out. Seems like it resonates. Let's do something. Find other partners who can jump in on this. Amazon wants to negotiate. Oh, they want to say they're going to cap it. Okay, cool. We collect the win. And I'm not sure if it would be helpful to get into, and then we did this, or then we used the base to do this or capitalize on that, or to step back. And, you dropped us some really juicy breadcrumbs here. I'm curious about how you assess for appetite among a group of people. We've all been there, whether it's in a neighborhood meeting. And we're like, I don't know, in my neighborhood in Greensboro recently, a mixed class group, mostly Black residents, recently did a whole lot of work around a primary election, and just went through then figuring out, all right, what do we want to do now? Like, we feel like a little powerful, and we've all done the thing before for the first time together in this neighborhood. What do we want to do now? What do we want to take on next? And so I'm curious about how you all assess for that sort of campaign appetite. But also, you said, hey, I got schooled a certain way around campaigning, me, Caitlin, and we're doing something totally different. And I'm curious about that too. So I'll just let you take it wherever you think makes sense.
Sure. I mean, I would love to talk about both because I'm super interested in like these subjects. I think that to start with, maybe I'll start with the latter and go back in time in terms of like the history of where I come up. So I, spend a lot of time thinking about how to not only make our ideas more accessible, but make our progressive ideas and stories better by engaging on the ground. But I think that we need to actually look at the way that philanthropy and private progressive philanthropy has really shaped how we've thought about organizing in containers, because we are a country that's so far into a late stage of capitalism, very different from the way that capitalism is playing out in some parts of the world. Particularly, I'm thinking about my experience in life and ancestors in Eastern Europe. And so I think that we really need to understand like the way that white supremacy in the US has intersected with late stage capitalism. And I'll be really specific about what I mean about that, right? So the wealth of this country comes from white supremacy and exploitation of labor. And at the same time, we can look at the ways that the wealthy and powerful have benefited from our thinking about how we organize being fairly elitist, in my opinion. So I was knowingly and unknowingly trained into those kind of spaces. And then you have progressive funders, most of whom paid my rent in one way or another through nonprofits I worked in. And what happened was there was a cherry picking of organizations, often based on individual leaders, and those leaders were often seen as funder darlings. And I came up in that space, and I'd go on panels and to conferences and do the circuit and give my shtick along with a lot of other really smart people. And I think that, there are a lot of distances between that kind of work, much of which, I live in the contradiction, benefited the country tremendously, benefited my life tremendously. We're able to win a lot of things, and the kind of work that I think we need now. And I think that a lot of the tradition of grassroots organizing that I think is the most powerful, a lot of those folks didn't call themselves community organizers. They were, making positive changes in their neighborhood or in their tenement buildings, right? Without even really thinking about that as community organizing. And so I trained up understanding campaigns as very much about, okay, let's see if we can get the light fixed on the corner of the block. Can we work together to do that, right? Then what's the next, win? Can we convince city council that, we need to get the cops out of schools, right? Like those kinds of campaigns where there was an arc, you were building community power, you had a specific goal you were focused on, and you were able to achieve that. So I want to be really clear. I think those kinds of grassroots neighborhood and local campaigns are incredibly powerful. I think a neighborhood work and local work around organizing is incredibly powerful and important. I think the issue becomes when we think on the national level that very small groups of people are going to be able to engage huge groups of people and convince them, quote unquote, to do what they want them to do, right? I think it, in fact, for me, what I've come to with the kind of work that I think is my role to do is that we're actually doing a lot of very wide, quite shallow work. And I say shallow not as a bad thing. I actually think, and my friend Lisa Anderson says, I like to swim in the shallow water. I like to swim and there's a lot of other people in the water and I'm not going in that deep, right? And I came out of work, much of which really impacted my life and built a network of people that I'm still in relationship with, where we were working with a smaller group of people very, very deeply, right? To then those leaders go out and work in different places. And at Women's March, a lot of the campaigning we're doing now is testing what's important to people at a large scale and seeing where that aligns with our values. Again, we're really only testing on ideas and concepts that align with our values. And if folks pick that up, we're moving on those campaign ideas. And it's a very different way of engaging folks. And I think that it actually goes back to a subject that I think doesn't really get enough airtime at all, which is, I hear a lot of conversations about what does membership mean now, like in organizing. But I think that building memberships, which implies retaining members, right? Bringing them in, training, and retaining them is very significant in some of the organizations that we need and some of the formations we need. But I think another really important subject is how do we think about mass scale political identity development and literally just welcoming people into the movement? My colleague Tamika Middleton says, you can't go much more open to engagement and lower the barriers to engagement much more than a sign and a Sharpie, right? And that's what the Women's March was. The first Women's March was not anything that any leader in the history of this organization made happen. It was a spontaneous action that a container was built around, and that list was preserved. And from that, we built an organization. But I think it's really important to understand that, I think about how often in the South there would be a tongue-in-cheek joke about every white progressive person, Southerner, said they marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right? We know that not all of them did. But that's always kind of like, oh, this horrible thing. Look at the white people again. Well, what if we thought about that argument in a different way? Every white Democrat who's a baby boomer tells themselves a story about them being in that march, and that often results in them voting Democratic for a very large set of elections. I think that's a positive thing. My parents, my mom is a white immigrant. My dad is a white dude whose family's been here longer. They talk about the Equal Rights Amendment. They talk about feminism. They talk about marching around the Vietnam War. They talk about, seeing the images on TV and their parents seeing the images on TV of the dogs and water hoses being turned on young Black children. Like, those were political identity formation events for them, right? As white baby boomers living in this country from two different immigrant paths. I actually think that's really significant. So, what do we have right now? We have, politics in this country being seen by most everyday people as controlled by elites, the left and the right. And what gets left out so often is, where are the political identity formation moments? Not how do people become lifelong political operatives, but how do people cement their basic core ideas about how they think about politics in a country where 90% of folks do not see themselves as political. To bring it back to campaigns, to me, a lot of the core purpose is not about the individual wins, right? And whether we believe that they, quote, trickle down or not, which is a whole nother conversation. It's about what are the actions that people take, whether in relationship to campaigns, whether mobilizing, whether they see something like the Women's March as more about, like the same way they would participate in Mother's Day. They would participate in the Women's March with their auntie, with their kid in the stroller, with their grandma, right? Like, where are the things that form political identity? And I am actually interested in the campaigns that we're able to engage, or the actions that we do that further that, because I see that as our role. 85% of marchers are marching for the first time with Women's March. From a membership based understanding, that's terrible, right? That's awful. There's almost no retention there at all. We're not retaining a base. But we are not in the change business of retention. We are in the change business of political identity formation. And that means that we're often the welcome mat and the on ramp, and those folks go elsewhere, right? They're really interested in corporate accountability and feminism. They might go to ultraviolet. They're really interested in Black feminist organizing. They might go to Black Feminist Future, right? Like, they might go to Color of Change. They might go a whole variety of ways. They may get involved with the ACLU. They may go to Greenpeace. They might also go to their local grassroots organizations, So I think that there's different roles, and I think we need to think about, the time is so incredibly politicizing, and people are so incredibly aware of how much is at stake. What they don't want to hear is, oh, hi, we got this handled. Us 10,000, elite Navy SEALs of the left, we're thinking about your fate, the air you breathe, and your babies. But you don't need to play a role in that. We got this. They don't believe us. They're not convinced by our story or our wins. They're like, yeah, okay, you want to create a big vehicle to harness all of our power? Awesome, because they're my kids too. It's my air too, and it's my life too. Which is why I think that the sister marches are just as significant as the Women's March. And there are sister marchers here in Phoenix. They're like, that's nice. You're the deputy director. We got this. We run the Phoenix Women's March. Like, have a nice one. They don't care whether I show up or not. I think that's fantastic, right? Just as fantastic as, the dog sledding marchers in Ketchikan, Alaska, where it's the grandmas, and they're out in the snow. Like, that is actually what I think is the decentralized part. But you cannot hold things really tight and also have it be decentralized. You're going to break a lot of eggs. People always write us, oh, I don't like the way this march was handled. Maybe we wouldn't either. It wasn't our march. We give them tools, but we're not actually holding the work that tightly. And I think that campaigns, and I could give some more specific examples, but I think the reason we think about campaigns in a very loose way is because we think about our work in a very strategic, but not tightly or controlled held way.
I really appreciate you breaking down those distinctions. And obviously that's not all that you all do. Like, you have, I think, political education programs that are weeks long, study groups. But I am curious about this question of, so what purpose do they serve? Because you're, I think, really helping me also get clearer about, one of the reasons that we started this podcast was a lot of people seem to think it's an electoral campaign. And so there's a clear goal. We're going to get this person elected, and it's a timeline. Or the campaign is we're responding to a bad thing, we're mobilizing people all at once in some kind of a way, and or yeah, the traditional understanding that I got too, also mostly from the Black Southern movement tradition, which is, we are trying to improve our material conditions. We're trying to like really focus our collective action, get this done, move these pillars of power out of the way so that we can make this new future reality happen. And I really appreciate what you're saying, which is, and there's also the welcome mat or the way in for a lot of people is often a campaign. I mostly have examples of that are like in Washington, D.C., it was Cop Watch for a lot of people when I was coming up, or it was Food Not Bombs group, or it was another thing, depending on the neighborhood and the environment you were in. And it wasn't often an organization that had this orientation to like, we exist to welcome people, also to equip them to understand how to have effective collective action, build power together, which seems to also be your orientation. What role did a campaign specifically play for you all in that process? And if you have other examples, I'd love to hear them.
We should not be positioned as the people who say, we're having the big house party, but we're going to check if you have the invitation at the door. I think we need to be like, you're invited. If you align with our basic values, you're welcome. I think that we have an unfortunate history of having a lot more baked in elitism in progressive movements than we've wanted to admit. And so campaigns are one of the key ways, not that we show and prove how smart we are and how fancy and tricky and how much above everyone else we are, but that we can actually show that we give a shit about the material conditions of people by what we want to wage fights about. And so I think that that is the key part that we play. And that's the way that campaigns intersect. They're the way that we land the plane in many ways. So we do give a shit about, gas prices, about formula, about the cost of diapers and wipes, and here's how we're going to talk about it. And I don't like to give a lot of airtime to the right-wing strategies, but I do think it's important to name that they're often a lot better at decentralized organizing than us. Every time in the past several months I went to the gas pump, there was a sticker that somebody had put on that said, Biden brought you this, pointing to the cost of gas at every gas pump I went to. It was very smart. It worked really well. And yet we don't really think about resourcing decentralized things like that. Billboards, sticker campaigns. Here, take these messages and go out, because we think, we need to screen folks. We need them to prove that they are worthy of carrying our messages. And that's fundamentally elitist. And so I think that when we're thinking about campaigns, we really have to understand that we're in a new time. In real life and online are moving back and forth all the time for people. And we are seeing a sort of trickle up, trickle around, trickle across effect that happens with narrative, which I think is very different than economics. And so our campaigns can't be disconnected from our narratives. We don't have enough time to even begin to talk about the impact of the reproductive rights crisis in this country and how, what impact it's had on Women's March. I can tell you that, we are under so much pressure from our base that we accept happily because we want them to hold us accountable, to try to build the kind of scale and resource for the organization that they want it to be, because they are so angry about a constitutional right to our bodies being taken away from 51% of the population. So we can talk about who's most impacted, and we should, but we also should see the fact that 51% of this country lost a constitutional right, regardless of age. I feel it deeply, and I'm a lesbian, and I had a hysterectomy. It's not a pressing, visceral issue for me, but it is a pressing issue for me as a person who identifies as a woman, as a person who identifies as queer, for all of the reasons. And the work is on us to connect that. So I'll give you an example. Like we got feedback, to not call our this past summer of activities, Summer of Rage. We got feedback from other partners. No, it's not, makes us sound too angry, it's going to make the right wing mad. Well, guess what? That's how our base actually felt. And we don't exist to sugarcoat and dilute their political will. We exist to unleash their political will on this fucking country. That's what we exist to do. We didn't save it so that 5 or 10 of us were going to try to be the next ones in vogue and be famous. No, like the people involved in our leadership are actually committed to everyday women across race and place and a whole bunch of other identities having a voice at the table. And guess what? Traditional progressive politics and traditional conservative politics do not guarantee that voice. So we need to have that voice outside in mass based organization. So, guess what happened? Our folks showed up because they felt like Summer of Rage spoke to them. Actions, we did a tactical banner job saying to Biden, like, do something basically. Not a lot of organizations were doing that, but because we did it and we got press about it, we were saying, yeah, it's a both and. It's hard to name. Like executive orders and executive action is not going to cure what ails us. It is not going to transform and change back the incredible loss that we had with Roe v. Wade, etc. But they are very necessary band-aids to triage the massive suffering happening. And guess what? Our base completely got that. So we move that from Summer of Rage to Fall of Reckoning. What does Fall of Reckoning really look like in terms of how we're thinking about campaign work? It moves us into a space where we're creating space for how we want to, move our pack. We're not a huge pack. We're not even a huge organization. We're a less than $5 million organization in all of our entities, which many folks don't know. We're what, like 1% of the resources of Planned Parenthood. And yet we take our responsibility seriously and we decentralize a lot of our work. A lot of our work is the marchers moving the campaign work themselves. But that would be an example of how we think about how narrative moves into the mainstream culture and then weathers and sort of creates the weather globe for campaigns, right? Is a tactical banner drop, for folks who don't know, climbers get on a crane and they drop a huge banner and then the press gets that message about, essentially do something, Biden, don't just sit there. And then is the president of the United States going to say, well, I heard about the Women's March banner and now I'm going to do an executive set of, executive actions? No, that's never going to happen. Is that a full blown campaign? Probably not, probably not by any definition. But I think that the definitions of these terms are much more porous. So these sort of mini campaigns that we're running all the time, I think are actually very important. And like the last one I'll kind of, name, which again, I struggle even now to be like, what's a campaign, what's a not. But, we really wanted to move the message through the Summer of Rage work that, we won't go back. And so we saw those signs everywhere. We saw it picked up, in all of the press. And I was driving with my girlfriend down Central here in Phoenix. And, I saw a huge billboard that said, we won't go back. And then it just said Roe v. Wade, 1973, or whatever. And, I said to her, like, that's our messaging. And she was like, well, talk me through how. And I was like, well, that's the thing. Did we pay for that billboard? No. Would we ever have the money to pay for those billboards? No. Is it way more beautiful than anything the non-visual person, would make? Absolutely. But the trickle down effect is if you don't need to hold everything so tightly and take credit all the time, it's like, is that a message that other people were parroting and talking about? Yeah, of course. And then local artists pick it up and then you're changing the conversation. And so I think that, where campaigns help us to get concrete about changing the conversation is also a place that I think we really want to be, especially because we are not a local organization, and we don't want to pretend to be, because local organizations, do completely different work. That's vital. And that's not our work. Our work is really different.
I think a lot of the people listening to this maybe don't have the experience of realizing, wow, we've got all these resources. The organization has so much reach. But they do have the experience of coming in and getting trained in one tradition and then wondering about how that fits in with their current reality. And you mentioned earlier about getting trained up in a campaigning tradition like I did that understood campaigns as being about winning short-term changes to material conditions like get the light fixed on the corner, get cops out of schools. And you've been framing the Women's March approach differently, describing some actions I'd consider tactics, like, one-off tactics that can be done purposefully outside the strategic arc of what we at Training for Change would consider a campaign. And so you have your sense of what collective action looks like, whether it's a campaign or not, whether it fits your understanding or not. And then realizing at some point, oh, there's another way of doing things, or now I'm positioned in a different way or have a different role, or it's a different time of, well, wait a second. So the things I know to be true or I did, they were working before. Now this is different. And I think basically all of us have had that experience at some point, even if you've just got into movement work a couple months ago in terms of thinking about yourself in this way as a campaigner, activist, organizer, whatever. So I'm curious about what that's been like for you or how you were able to recognize it and embrace, especially given, what you said about embracing the idea of going wide and shallow. And I think people in your tradition, some of my traditions are like that. Those would be seen as like bad words. So I'm curious about what you learned about recognizing the moment or about being able to shift in that way that might be helpful for the rest of us who are at some point going to have a moment like that too.
What led me to this path is the emphasis away from the individual towards the collective. And a lot of that means that you're the one creating the infrastructure and people don't know your name. They don't know your name. And that's okay with you because we need hundreds and hundreds and thousands of leaders who are fine with that, who are fine with delivering wins in campaigns and in movement work right now. And maybe we're not going to have the longest Wikipedia of life. And who gives a shit? Because when we're dead, that's really not what's going to matter to my kid, probably to yours. So I think that experience of finally writing, strategizing, organizing, and infrastructure building in a way that centers those values has actually made me, I feel a lot less pressure to be perfect. Not that I ever was. I feel a lot less pressure to be doing the kind of work that's deeply uncreative because I'm afraid of making mistakes. To be like, I'm just going to paint with a looser brush here. Let's see. Maybe it'll work. Maybe it won't. But let's give it a try. And that I think it's quite, dare I say, liberating. And so I hope that other organizers might also have opportunities to think about how they could explore feeling more liberated, maybe more happy even in their personal life, as I do, embracing that kind of set of goals instead of trying to be in this sort of competitive zero sum game of who's the next progressive savior, who's the flavor of the month on campaigns or organizing or narrative. It would do much better to just kind of put that by the wayside and move forward collectively, playing our best roles as best we can.
Well, as you know, you have definitely influenced my thinking about how those of us on the left who are trying to bring people together to build power and change our current and future realities should be looking at ourselves differently with your framing or Southern New Zone New Grounds framing of movement plagues and movement antidotes. And you've clearly given us a few of your sharp sense of what's some of what's plaguing us around elitism, around how we think of ourselves and other people who should be part of the big we, and what some of the antidotes are. But just thinking about where we're at in 2022, or people that you're in relationship with are at, or people you met at the convention, the Women's March convention that just happened, are at. Is there a wish? Is there an insight? Is there another offering or lesson you want more deeply for us to even just to expose us to, or that we should internalize, that you think would really help us meet the moment that we're in today?
And I think the first thing that surfaces is the Buddhist American thinker Pema Chodron, said, we don't set out first to change the world. We set out to find out how other people are doing. And I actually think trying to find out how other people are doing and give a shit about that is actually a pretty big deal right now. I would encourage everybody who is an organizer to just, so many of us have lost a lot of the skills around conversation and engaging people over COVID. And that's such a dangerous and difficult thing to lose when you're an organizer. And as I mentioned earlier, one thing I try to do every day is just have an openness to find out how other people are doing, and this makes me a really annoying person to run errands with because I like to talk to people. I talk to people in stores, I talk to people at gas stations, I talk to people at bars, and I don't talk to them about that much deep shit all the time. I just, how are you doing, how your day's going. And it's amazing how much people will tell you when you just ask them and engage them. And I think that little by little, inch by inch, getting away from the sort of cyber spheres where we're hearing a lot about how people who think a lot like us are doing and are thinking about how they're doing, and into some spaces where we're engaging not avatars but other humans in real time. I think that it's actually a lot more important than we think, especially the listening part. I don't come to this world as a gifted listener. I try to be a better listener every day, all the time. And I think that if and when we do that and we don't hold ourselves apart or think that we have the special analysis that's going to solve all the world's problems, but really find out how more about how other people are doing, that is really transformative. And then allowing that to inform our day-to-day work anecdotally. Working class people are the original geniuses at synthesizing anecdotal information to understand where can you get the most affordable pants for your kids, to how to think about you know what to do with food stamps and how to share them around, and work collaboratively, like all of the things that anecdotal knowledge actually gives us, because data is very relative, very subjective and very relative right now, especially when we think about mis and disinformation. And then the other thing I would say is actually I think a lot about marathon feminism versus sprint feminism, and I think about being an enduring but hardy leader. And I definitely am sobered thinking about some of the stories that broke publicly around Women's March and how Women's March was infiltrated by essentially Russian bots. And it wasn't only that those Russian bots were going for individual folks that were leading Women's March. At the time, they were also pretending to be Black women, talking about how racist Women's March was, pretending to be white women, saying there's no place for me, pretending to be conservative women who were on the outside, pretending to be trans women who were angry at Women's March. And I really would like to talk about the fact that this happened, not because there's not, of course, racism and transphobia and ableism and all kinds of societal ills inside of our culture and inside of an organization as big as the Women's March space, but rather that I heard those divisive conversations that were coming from bots in Moscow, from funders, donors, and partners about the Women's March again and again. And what we always ask at Women's March is, who said it? Which Black women hate us? Like, who's angry with us? Who can we get an email? We want to call this person. We want to talk to these people. And so I just think it's really important, because when we went about trying to save the Women's March, I can't tell you how many rooms I was either laughed out of or told maybe it could be saved, but not by the kind of likes of y'all. You know, you're going to need a superstar to do that. And, you know, that really gives me pause when I think about what we're willing to believe without going to people directly. And if we can't figure out how to have some more robust, defensive, and protective thinking of our own organizations. Women's March is the biggest progressive organization that was started, in the last several years. And not that many of us thought it was worth saving or protecting. And I think that's a really important cautionary tale that we really have to think about. If we can't even protect our own organizations and we believe mis and disinformation that much without trying to see if there's anything else there or if what is there is as much at scale as we're being led to believe, it's going to be very hard to win anything because we've already done COINTELPRO's job. We don't even need them. We're willing to take apart our own shit and leave it for dead. I really think that in this time, we have to get a lot better at not believing everything we hear, trying to find real information, not looking for who's the next person that we want to cancel, having real debate when there's real political difference, being willing to have that privately and not do everything on Twitter all the time, being willing to actually hold each other accountable human to human and not just fire off this public hate tweet and get really serious about enduring. We have been continuing to do this work no matter how many people didn't think it was a good idea, didn't like us, decided they hated us, decided it wasn't possible, and to continue going. And for me, that's because I have an incredible team that I have great alignment, political alignment with, but that's not always true. We often have to build that. And if we get scared every time we make a call that someone somewhere doesn't like, we're not going to get very much done. We need to be willing to have the courage to also pick the political fights and make them not only solely personal, but also sometimes they're political and they're about political and strategic difference, and we need to have those conversations. So I think that was actually like 7 things instead of 1, but thank you for being patient and hearing me out about them.
Caitlin Breedlove, thank you for your many offerings here and in the past and going forward. Appreciate you and appreciate your time.
Thank you.
The Craft of Campaigns podcast is a project of the Organizing Skills Institute at Training for Change and made possible by grassroots donors. Visit Training for Change for workshops, training tools, and other resources. We welcome your feedback and nominations for other campaigns that should be featured on this podcast. If you like these episodes, please consider donating to keep the show running. This podcast is produced by Ali Roseberry Polier. I'm Andrew Willis Garces. See you next time.